It begins in silence. Thick, subterranean, almost church-like silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something vast and unfinished. Something that once vibrated with the labor of thousands, and the will of one man who believed he could bend the world to his will by sheer force of steel and pressure. The tunnels of the Mimoyecques complex stretch deep under the chalk hills of northern France, carved into the earth by men who would never be remembered. Their footsteps are gone, their voices erased, but the shape they left behind remains. Long, sloping corridors that vanish into darkness, concrete chambers that echo the memory of explosions, and the scars of an idea that was supposed to change the war and perhaps the century itself. In those long forgotten caverns, Hitler's engineers tried to build a weapon that defied imagination. A cannon so immense, so nightmarishly ambitious that even now it feels more like the fever dream of a dying empire than a military project. They called it the Hochdruckpumpe, the high-pressure pump. Historians prefer another name, V3, the Doomsday Cannon. The idea was simple in the way terrible things often are. If you cannot win the skies, if your cities burn, if your armies are bleeding out on the Eastern Front, then build something bigger, something impossible, something that could hurl death across the English Channel with the cold regularity of a machine. Build a weapon that does not ask permission, that cannot be intercepted, that does not need pilots or rockets or the fragile infrastructure Germany was losing day by day. Build a gun so long its barrel is a tunnel, so powerful it must be buried in a mountain, so monstrous it could obliterate London without a warning shot. Even inside the Reich, the project felt like a secret whispered too loudly. The men assigned to Mimoyecques did not know the full plan, and perhaps they did not want to. They only knew that Hitler had ordered a weapon that would make the V1 flying bombs look like toys, and the V2 rockets like prototypes. He wanted something biblical, something that would rain steel upon the British capital until their spirit collapses. By 1943, he had become obsessed with the idea that one decisive strike, one unbearable wave of destruction, could force London to its knees. The war was slipping through his fingers, and desperation makes believers of even the most pragmatic men. But Hitler was not pragmatic. He was already living in a world of fantasies and catastrophes of his own making. V3 was simply the next step down. For the people imprisoned and forced to dig the tunnels, none of this mattered. They were dragged here from across Europe. Poles, Russians, Belgians, Czechs, French prisoners accused of resistance, shoved into the damp blackness with pickaxes, and promises they knew were lies. Many died in collapses. Many more simply vanished into the earth. Officially, the site was a limestone quarry. Unofficially, it was a grave. Engineers in crisp uniforms walked through the galleries with blueprints and pencils behind their ears, explaining the angles of the shafts, the thickness of the concrete, the position of the firing chambers, while behind them, men coughed blood into the chalk dust that coated their lungs. From the outside, Mimoyecques looked almost pastoral, rolling hills, a quiet French village, fields that swayed in the wind. But beneath that soil, a weapon was being assembled whose scale bordered on madness. The main gallery, a long, slanted trench carved directly into the hillside, would hold 5 enormous barrels, each longer than a football field, each reinforced with rings of steel and concrete. From those barrels would extend dozens of side chambers, small, angled shafts that would hold secondary explosive charges. No gun in history had ever been built this way. It was not a cannon so much as an enormous mechanical lung. The projectile would be ignited at the base of the barrel, then hurled upward, accelerating as one charge after another detonated along the sides, each explosion giving it one more violent shove. If everything worked perfectly, if the timing was flawless, if the pressure did not rupture the tube, if the sledgehammer force of the charges did not tear the mountain apart, The projectile would fly out of the barrel at such speed that it could travel 165 kilometers and land in London. The First World War had given birth to the Paris gun, a massive artillery piece that bombarded the French capital from over 100 kilometers away. Hitler wanted something bigger, something faster, something apocalyptic. He wanted a gun that could fire not once a day, but dozens of times an hour. A weapon that would, in his own words, turn the streets of London into trenches. The deeper you go into the tunnels, the easier it is to understand why the Allies feared Mimoyecques. There is a claustrophobic dread to the place, a sense of being inside the ribcage of some mechanical beast. The walls still carry the stains of oil and rust. Bits of machinery were abandoned as if the workers fled suddenly. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The grind of drills, the burst of explosives, the shouted orders echoing down the stone corridors. And beneath that, something else. The steady, monstrous thrum of an idea that should never have lived as long as it did. London never knew how close it came. At the time, British intelligence believed the German superweapon program was centered on rockets. They had learned to fear the V-1, the flying bomb with its rattling engine, and the sudden silence that meant it was falling. They had come to dread the V-2, the supersonic missile that struck without warning. But V-3 was different. There would be no sirens, no engine noise, no trail in the sky. Only sudden detonations, block after block. Market squares, rail stations, neighborhoods. A storm of steel every hour. The psychological effect alone could have broken the city. Hitler believed this. Himmler believed it. Even the engineers, tired and hollow-eyed, believed it. The only ones who didn't were the slaves building the tunnels. They were too busy fighting to live another night. Above ground, Allied reconnaissance planes buzzed over the French countryside, taking blurry photographs that analysts pored over like sacred texts. They saw ventilation shafts, rail lines, fortified entrances. They saw something big, something hidden, something that did not belong. And so the story of V-3 was set, a race between the men digging the world's longest cannon and the men flying above them, trying to understand what nightmare was emerging from the chalk. The truth would come too late for some, but just in time for millions. The idea of the V-3 was born not in the tunnels of northern France, but in the mind of an artillery fanatic named August Koenders, a German engineer who believed that the future of warfare did not belong to rockets at all. Rockets, he argued, were unstable, expensive, and dangerously unreliable. But a gun was simple, predictable, reusable. A gun did not need fuel tanks or delicate guidance systems. It needed only pressure and steel, and, in his case, a mountain to bury it in. Koenders had spent years studying multi-charge artillery, sketching designs in which a projectile was not accelerated by a single explosion, but by a series of timed charges detonating one after another. Each charge would fire into the barrel through a port, angled toward the direction of travel. The concept wasn't new. Artillery theorists had imagined it since the 19th century, but no one had ever truly attempted it. The pressures were too high, the timing too precise, the materials too fragile. A misfire, even a delay of a millisecond, would cause the projectile to shatter or the barrel to explode. Most nations dismissed the idea as a technical curiosity. But Germany in 1943 was no longer a nation driven by engineering practicality. It was driven by desperation. So, when Koenders presented his idea to the Waffenamt, the weapons office, they forwarded it upward, straight into the hands of a Führer who was looking for a miracle. Hitler did not want another weapon. He wanted the weapon, something symbolic, something that would let him announce to the world that Germany still held the power to reshape Europe through terror alone. And so he approved Koenders' proposal almost instantly, despite the objections of his own artillery experts. What Koenders had drawn on paper now needed to be built in stone. The final blueprint bordered on madness. Barrel length 124 meters, 407 feet. Caliber 150 millimeters. Number of auxiliary charge chambers up to 32 per barrel. Projectile weight 140 kilo, 310 lbs. Projectile muzzle velocity up to 1,500 Mimoyecques. Maximum firing range estimated 165 km. London was 151 km away. Planned rate of fire up to 600 shells per hour from multiple barrels firing in sequence. Improvised field versions built later would be much smaller, but Mimoyecques was different. Mimoyecques was the cathedral. Each of the 5 primary shafts cut into the hill was angled 50 degrees upward, pointing like the fingers of a buried giant directly toward the British capital. Each shaft was lined with reinforced concrete more than 2 meters thick, then fitted with the inner steel lining that formed the barrel. Along the length of this barrel, pairs of angled chambers were drilled every 5 meters, the side charges that would ignite as the projectile raced upward. The timing was the heart of the machine. Each charge had to detonate at the exact moment the projectile passed its port. Too soon, and the explosion would push backward, slowing the shell. Too late, and the pressure spike could rupture the barrel. The engineers devised electrical timing circuits based on magnetic switches, triggered by the projectile's passing. But even they admitted the system was dangerously temperamental. Still, they pressed forward. Not because they believed the weapon was safe, but because they believed it might work, and because the man in Berlin demanded that it must. The construction phase became a nightmare of logistics. To install a single barrel, engineers needed 6,000 tons of reinforced concrete, 1,000 tons of steel, a tunnel network nearly 1.6 kilometers in total length, a workforce of more than 2,500 laborers, many of them forced labor. The chalk hills were easy to carve, but they were also unstable. Collapses killed dozens. Ventilation was poor. The air filled with dust so thick, the workers described it as breathing chalk. Engineers complained constantly about moisture seeping into the shafts. Water dripped down the concrete walls. It pooled at the base of the gallery. It corroded fittings faster than they could be replaced. And yet, the work continued. Above ground, the hill was scarred by rail lines, bunkers, and camouflaged entrances disguised as farm buildings. Cows grazed quietly nearby. To the untrained eye, nothing looked extraordinary, just another fortified German position in occupied France. But the French resistance noticed immediately. The construction was too large, too secretive, too important. Reports filtered to London describing an enormous installation, long inclined tunnels, and a project of special significance. But even then, British intelligence misinterpreted the purpose. They assumed it was another V2 site, or a factory, or an ammunition depot. No one yet imagined a cannon longer than St. Paul's Cathedral. Inside the tunnels, engineers began installing the first test barrel. It had taken months just to prepare the shaft, line up the supports, and hoist the steel sections into place. When the workers tightened the final bolts, the barrel looked less like a weapon and more like an underground railway tunnel tipped upward toward the sky. The test projectiles were simple, fin-stabilized darts, almost 2 meters long, designed purely for range. Filled with steel, not explosives, they were intended only to prove the gun could launch an object across the channel. On the surface, a small observation bunker was built with periscopes and slit windows. It was cramped, thick-walled, and smelled of damp limestone and oil. Officers took their positions behind thick glass. Electrical cables snaked down into the tunnels. Engineers busied themselves with the charge circuits, muttering about timing relays and current irregularities. Everyone knew what could go wrong. Everyone had seen the diagrams showing what would happen if a side charge detonated too early. The barrel would bulge outward like a ruptured vein, spraying molten steel and rock through the tunnels. There would be no survivors. The countdown began. From the observation bunker, one of the officers later wrote that the moment before ignition was the longest silence he ever lived through. There was no majestic firing sound, No single thunderous crack. Instead, the shot resembled the roll of distant artillery, stretched into a stuttering roar, thud, 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 as charge after charge ignited inside the mountain. The ground shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. One man instinctively threw himself to the floor, believing the bunker itself was collapsing. And then, suddenly, it was over. Smoke drifted from the mouth of the barrel. The projectile vanished into the sky, leaving behind only a faint echo. Later, calculations suggested the test shot traveled nearly 88 kilometers, far short of London, but far enough to terrify Allied analysts once they understood what was happening. But the tests also revealed the weapon's fatal weaknesses. The barrel warped slightly under pressure. Timing irregularities caused several of the charges to fire microseconds late. One misfired entirely, creating a pressure dip that almost stalled the projectile. Engineers argued bitterly about solutions. Some wanted stronger steel. Others wanted redesigned charges. Coenders insisted the system was sound. It merely needed refinement. Hitler didn't care about refinement. He wanted results. He demanded that the full battery at Mimoyecques be operational by mid-1944. That was the real impossibility. The mountain itself resisted the project. The tunnels were too wet, the ventilation too poor. Reinforcing the other 4 shafts would take months. And even if they succeeded, the weapon would require a constant supply of charges, propellant, and projectiles that Germany could no longer easily produce. But the engineers did not stop. They could not stop. The Reich no longer tolerated the word impossible. While they worked, Allied reconnaissance grew increasingly suspicious. More photos, more reports, more speculation. The hill at Mimoyecques was beginning to look less like a fortress, and more like something else entirely. A buried weapon, a giant aimed at the heart of London, something that had to be destroyed before it awakened. By early 1944, the Mimoyecques complex was no longer just an engineering project. It had become a race against time. The men inside the tunnels knew it. The officers overseeing construction knew it. Even the French villagers whose fields concealed the entrances felt the tension in the air. The war was turning decisively against Germany. The Red Army had broken through at Kursk. The Allies were bombing factories that once seemed untouchable. Food was running short, fuel scarcer still. But Hitler believed, truly believed, that a single blow could change everything. V3 was that blow. Inside the Reich Chancellery, he spoke of it not as a weapon, but as a salvation. The London der Großgeschütz, he called it, the Great London Gun. When finished, it would rain steel across the British capital in a constant, merciless barrage. It would break the will of Churchill, shatter the morale of civilians, force the government to the negotiating table. And in his mind, the British people would finally understand the power of a Germany that refused to die. This conviction, delusional as it was, turned the project into an obsession. Orders from Berlin arrived with manic urgency. Accelerate concrete pouring, reinforce the firing chambers, expand the workforce, increase the shell production run, prepare for continuous fire capability. The original design called for 5 firing tunnels, each meant to house 2 parallel barrels, 10 V3 guns aimed at London. If each barrel could deliver even a fraction of its intended rate, perhaps 1 to 2 rounds per minute, the city could suffer a bombardment of 600 shells per hour, as German planners claimed. Even the conservative estimates suggested hundreds dead every day, thousands injured, a terrified metropolis. But for all their ambition, the engineers were fighting physics itself. The multi-charge system required near-perfect synchronization. Each projectile was to be accelerated by a sequence of up to 32 explosive chambers, angled at 45 degrees into the barrel. The firing sequence had to match the shell's position with less than a millisecond of error. Pressure levels inside the barrel were calculated to reach 4,500 × 500 bar, 65,000 to 80,000 solemn psi, enough to rupture thick steel if any timing faltered. Worse, the auxiliary charges created sharp pressure spikes, forming shock waves that fractured the internal lining. After only a handful of test shots, engineers found scoring scars along the barrel walls, each a potential failure point. The mountain groaned under the strain of a weapon it was not meant to hold. But while the engineers worried, Allied intelligence grew anxious. Aerial reconnaissance had noted unusual activity near Mimoyecques. Heavy rail traffic, large ventilation shafts, tunnel entrances with reinforced blast doors. Analysts first suspected it might be a V-2 storage site, but something felt wrong. There were too many sloping shafts, too deeply angled, too much excavation for rockets. Then came a breakthrough. In December 1943, the French resistance delivered a hand-drawn sketch of the complex. Crude, uncertain, but unmistakable. It showed a long, inclined tunnel leading underground. Another informant reported an enormous tube being assembled inside a cavern. A third claimed to have overheard German officers bragging about a weapon that could hit England before the Allies set foot in France. The reports were vague, sometimes contradictory, but they converged on one point. Something unprecedented was being built in the hills above Calais. In London, alarm bells rang. The British Air Ministry analyzed the sketches and photos. Experts from the Directorate of Scientific Intelligence debated possibilities late into the night. Rockets, fuel depots, an underground factory, nothing fit. Nothing except one terrifying hypothesis: a supergun, a monster gun, an artillery piece capable of reaching 150 kilometers, a weapon that could hit London not once, but continuously. The British had seen such a thing before. The Paris gun of 1918 had fired shells into the French capital from 120 kilometers away, each shot climbing into the stratosphere before descending at supersonic speed. That gun destroyed buildings and killed civilians, despite firing only 183 shells in 5 months. But V-3 was different. It promised not dozens of shells, not hundreds, thousands. If the Germans succeeded, London would become a battlefield again. The decision was immediate. Mimoyecques had to be destroyed, but destroying it would not be simple. The site sat beneath up to 30 meters of solid chalk, reinforced with concrete, steel, and earth. Conventional bombs would do little. Medium bombers could not penetrate. Even Lancaster heavy bombers struggled to drop ordnance with precision. Britain needed something new. Enter the Tallboy. Designed by aeronautical genius Barnes Wallis, the Tallboy was a 5.4-ton earthquake bomb, shaped like a streamlined torpedo. Dropped from 18,000 feet, it reached near supersonic speeds and burrowed deep into the ground before exploding. The shockwaves could collapse structures from below: tunnels, bunkers, submarine pens. It was not a bomb that hit its target. It was a bomb that destroyed the ground under its target. Only one squadron could deliver it. Number 617 Squadron RAF, the Dam Busters. The first raid on Mimoyecques came on July 6, 1944. The Lancasters flew low over the channel, engines screaming in the warm summer air. Beneath them, the chalk cliffs and farmland blurred by. The crews knew little about their target, only that it was vital, heavily fortified, and must be destroyed at any cost. As they approached the hill, German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Black bursts filled the sky. The bombers climbed to their drop altitude. The bomb bays opened. The Tallboys fell. A Tallboy could penetrate 50 meters of earth or 5 meters of reinforced concrete before detonating. When the first one struck the hillside, the ground rippled. A dull, monstrous boom shook the countryside. One of the gallery entrances collapsed instantly, sealing dozens of workers inside. Another bomb ruptured the main ventilation shaft, sending a plume of dust into the sky. But the hill did not die. Inside the tunnels, dust fell like snow. Lights flickered. Men screamed in panic. The engineers feared that the barrels might buckle or the ceiling collapse entirely. But as the shaking stopped, they saw that the structure, just barely, had survived. And so Hitler demanded repairs. But the RAF was not finished. On July 17th, they returned, this time with even greater force. The Lancasters bombed the site for 2 full hours, dropping more tall boys than ever before. One bomb struck directly above the main gallery. The explosion carved a crater 30 meters wide and shattered the shaft below. Another tore through the eastern section, flooding the tunnels with rubble. This time, the damage was irreversible. Concrete supports snapped, steel beams twisted like paper. The first and second barrels, still incomplete, were crushed. Flooded with dust and debris, parts of the complex became inaccessible. Inside, the officers knew the truth. Mimoyecques was dead. Outside, the hill looked like the surface of the moon. After the second attack, the Germans halted all work. A few weeks later, following the Allied landings in Normandy, they abandoned the site entirely. London would never feel the wrath of V3. The shells would never scream across the channel. The Great Barrel would never fire its apocalyptic barrage. The Doomsday Cannon would die in the cradle. But the story of V3 was not finished. Hitler, furious at the setback, demanded the weapon be resurrected elsewhere, in smaller, portable forms. And what followed would be the final, desperate, almost pathetic chapter of a dream that refused to die. When the tunnels of Mimoyecques collapsed under the weight of British tallboys, the engineers knew the truth long before the SS admitted it. The dream of a supergun buried in a mountain was over, but in Berlin, Hitler refused to surrender the idea. The reports describing the destruction of the shafts infuriated him. He raged at Göring. He cursed the Luftwaffe for failing to protect the site. He accused the engineers of cowardly excuses and demanded to know why no one had anticipated such an attack. But beneath the fury lay a deeper fear. Fear that his last miracle weapon, his last promise of vengeance across the channel, had been stolen from him. Hitler had begun to speak of the V3 not just as a weapon, but as destiny. The Reich had already lost the skies over Germany. It had lost the cities of the Ruhr. It was losing in the east and bleeding in Italy. What remained to shake the world, if not a gun capable of pounding London into dust? So he ordered something desperate, something reckless, something almost pathetic in its scale compared to the original ambition. If the mountain gun was dead, then Germany would build a field version, a shortened V3, a weapon small enough to hide, fast enough to move, and simple enough to assemble with the resources still available to a collapsing Reich. The Army named it the LRK-15F58, the Leichte Rohrkanone, light barrel cannon. But nothing about it was light. Instead of 124 meters, the new barrels were only 45 meters long, still enormous by normal standards, but barely a third of the original design. The auxiliary charge chambers were reduced from 32 pairs to just 12, drastically cutting the acceleration intervals. The engineers hoped the simplified version would still achieve a respectable range, 25 to 40 kilometers, enough to strike Allied lines or cities near the front. And unlike the buried colossus of Mimoyecques, the new guns would be mounted in open pits or shallow bunkers. They would not be aimed at London. They would be aimed at anything Germany could reach. In August 1944, the SS pushed the project into frantic production. They chose the region of Lampeden, in southwestern Germany near Trier, to deploy the first battery. The location was close enough to strike Luxembourg City, barely 30 kilometers away, and deep enough within German territory to complicate Allied bombing efforts. The site resembled a quarry more than a battlefield. Shallow depressions, concrete supports, angled trenches built to hold the shorter barrels. Each weapon required a 45-meter steel tube, 12 angled side chambers, a reinforced base pivot, compressed powder charges, fin-stabilized 150mm projectiles weighing 45-50 kilos. The irony was bitter. The V-3 had begun as a weapon that was supposed to strike Britain, the last great enemy standing. Now it was reduced to a tool of harassment, an oversized siege gun, firing into a country that Germany had already occupied and lost. The first test at Lampadin was a far cry from the roaring underground thunder of Mimoyecques. There were no vast galleries, no mountain trembling under the chain of charges. The field version still produced the characteristic rolling detonation, thud, 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 as each chamber fired in sequence. But the earth did not shake. The weapon no longer felt like a mythic giant awakening. It felt like a wounded animal doing everything it could just to stay alive. Yet, even this crippled version worked. On December 30th, 1944, during one of the darkest winters of the war, the first operational shots were fired. The target was Luxembourg City, recently liberated by Allied forces, now a crucial logistics hub during the Battle of the Bulge. A shell weighing roughly 45 kilograms, with a muzzle velocity of around 1,000 MMS, arced over the front line. Its range, measured after recovery, was approximately 43 kilometers, far less than the original promise of 165 kilometers, but enough to strike the city with terrifying speed. The shell landed in the center of Luxembourg, exploding near a high school. 3 people were killed. 2 more were injured. It was not London. It was not thousands dead. It was not the apocalypse the Reich propaganda had promised. But it was the first, and nearly the last time the V-3 would ever be used in combat. The engineers at Lampadin continued to fire sporadically for several days. Some shells landed harmlessly in fields. Others struck buildings. Civilians fled to cellars, unsure of what kind of weapon was hitting them. Rockets, artillery, something new. In total, 183 shells were fired from the Lampadin site. Many were inaccurate. Several failed to detonate. But the psychological effect was real enough. A city already traumatized by occupation now felt the distant hand of the Reich reaching for it again. Still, the V-3's resurrection was collapsing as quickly as it had begun. The problems were countless. The barrels warped after only a few shots. The auxiliary chambers frequently misfired. Pressure imbalances reduced range and accuracy. American counter-battery fire forced crews to disperse. The guns required enormous amounts of propellant Germany could no longer spare. And most critically, Allied forces were advancing fast. By early 1945, American units were approaching the Lampadin region. The crews received orders to destroy the guns before retreating. They dismantled some components, detonated charges in the chambers, and abandoned what remained. When the Americans arrived, they found the wreckage of a weapon that could have marked a turning point in history, reduced to a twisted, burnt skeleton in a muddy pit. The documents captured at the site were even more revealing. They included barrel design cross-sections, charge timing diagrams, performance logs, range tables, correspondence between engineers and Berlin, frantic orders from Hitler demanding maximum operational tempo. One American intelligence officer, examining the diagrams, reportedly muttered, "They tried to build a cannon out of a mountain. And when that failed, they tried to build a mountain out of a cannon." Back in Berlin, Hitler never received the full report. By then, the V-3 was only one of dozens of miracle weapons he clung to, like a drowning man clutching driftwood. His world had shrunk to the concrete walls of the Führer bunker. His armies were in retreat. His Luftwaffe was in ruins. His hopes now rested on phantoms, jet fighters, rocket interceptors, invisible tanks, guided bombs, submarine wonders that would never leave port. The V-3, his dream of hammering London into submission, was gone. Gone in the chalk dust of Mimoyecques, gone in the muddy trenches of Lampadin, gone in the final collapse of a regime built on violence and delusion. But the most haunting irony remained. The V-3 worked. Not well, Not reliably, not enough to change the war, but it worked. The weapon that could have devastated London, that could have reshaped the psychological landscape of the war, that could have killed thousands, came inches from completion, inches from firing its first test barrage, inches from rewriting the story of 1944. The Allies destroyed it just in time. And as the war dragged toward its final, bloody spring, the Doomsday Cannon became what it remains today, an artifact of terror that never reached maturity, a dead weapon buried under a French hillside. But the ghosts of Mimoyecques still whisper in the dark, and the earth remembers what almost happened. In the final months of the war, as Germany burned from east to west, the story of the V3 faded into a thick, exhausted silence. It had been conceived in arrogance, engineered through brutality, constructed under fear, resurrected in desperation, and then abandoned, crushed by the inevitable collapse of a nation devoured by its own ambition. But the danger had been real, terrifyingly real, and only hindsight makes the failure of the V3 feel inevitable. At the time, it was anything but. After the American advance overran the Lampedusa site, Allied engineers and intelligence officers carefully documented the remains: bent metal, cracked concrete, ruptured auxiliary chambers, proof of the weapon's fragility, but also its feasibility. They collected fragments of shells, examined the scorched ports where the side charges had been installed, and measured the lengths of the truncated barrels. American analysts were stunned that the system had worked at all, given the catastrophic conditions Germany faced by late 1944. But the most chilling discovery lay not in the pits of Lampedusa, but in the tunnels of Mimoyecques. When the Allies inspected the underground complex in September 1944, the air was still heavy with chalk dust. The tunnel smelled of damp stone and diesel oil. Abandoned tools lay scattered across the floors. In one collapsed gallery, rescuers found the bodies of forced laborers, crushed beneath the weight of the chalk during the tallboy strikes, left where they fell. Electric cables dangled from ceilings cracked by the bomb shockwaves. Reinforced concrete sections had split like brittle bone. Steel support beams, designed to remain intact under extreme pressure, were twisted as if warped by heat. And yet, despite the destruction, the purpose of the complex was unmistakable. The inclined shafts, the immense running galleries, the rail switches that once carried sections of the colossal barrels, all pointed to the same horrific truth. The weapon had been moments, perhaps days, from partial readiness. One British analyst wrote in his report, "Had the enemy been afforded merely a month more, perhaps less, we might have seen London under bombardment of an unprecedented nature." The numbers confirmed it. Based on the surviving fragments of the steel liners, calculated curvature of the shafts, and recovered auxiliary chamber components, Allied engineers estimated that 2 of the barrels could have been operational by mid-August 1944, just weeks after the tallboy attacks. They would not have reached maximum intended performance. The barrel walls would likely have fatigued after a few dozen shots, but they would have fired. And even 30 shells landing across London in a 24-hour period, supersonic, nearly impossible to detect, immune to interception, would have caused terror on a scale not seen since the Blitz. Rail centers, hospitals, schools, marketplaces. No target would have been predictable. No warning would have preceded impact. Just the sudden, violent thunder of a supersonic shell punching into the heart of a city. For a London already battered by V1s and V2s, this third phantom weapon could have pushed morale to the breaking point. For the British government, it could have meant diverting even more fighter squadrons and bombers to counter an invisible threat. For the Allies preparing Operation Overlord, it could have complicated the logistical chaos of D-Day. For the global war effort, it could have meant delays, weeks, months, that cost thousands of lives. The V3 was a monster that almost opened its eyes. And that shadow remains, heavy, unsettling, impossible to ignore, because every element of the weapon, however flawed, was grounded in real engineering. The physics were sound, the metallurgy was possible, the explosive calculations were difficult, but solvable. The infrastructure existed. The barrels were already in place. The timing circuits were already wired. The projectiles were already manufactured. Mimoyecques was not a fantasy. It was an embryo. And the tallboy raids aborted it. Still, the V3 left marks far beyond the chalk hills of France. In the post-war years, the captured documents, blueprints, calculations, firing tables, were shipped to Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union for study. Most were dismissed as curiosities. Others became strange seeds that would grow in unexpected ways. The concept of multi-charge acceleration, once the obsession of August Coenders, found echoes decades later in research on electrothermal chemical guns, light gas accelerators, early railgun prototypes, high-velocity mass drivers. The V3 was archaic by modern standards, but its ambition foreshadowed the century to come. A world where nations would chase speed, range, and intimidation with ever more extreme concepts. What the Allies found in the tunnels was sobering. What they understood was haunting. What they feared was simple. If Germany had deployed the full V3 system in 1944, the war in Europe would not have ended in May 1945. The casualties would have mounted. The psychological toll would have been devastating. London might have lost faith in its own invincibility. The Allies might have been forced to reconsider their timelines. The Third Reich would still have died, but perhaps not before dragging tens of thousands more into the grave with it. History is full of horrors that happened. The V3 is one of the rare horrors that didn't, but almost did. And so today, the tunnels of Mimoyecques are quiet. The chalk dust has settled. Grass grows over the hill that once hid the skeleton of a weapon meant to destroy a city. Visitors walk through the galleries, their footsteps echoing off the walls carved by men who never saw freedom again. The air is cool, the silence deep, broken only by the occasional drip of groundwater seeping through the stone. In one of the collapsed firing shafts, sunlight filters through the rubble, illuminating the twisted steel of the ruined barrel. It lies there like the rib of some ancient, dead creature. A weapon that never breathed, a design that never lived, a monster that never quite escaped the stone womb that contained it. But if you stand there long enough, very still, very quiet, you can almost hear it. The imagined roar of charges firing in sequence. The chain reaction thunder rolling through the mountain. The echo of shells that never left the barrel. And you realize something profound. The world was spared not by inevitability, nor by genius, nor by fate, but by timing. A few months more, and history might have been written in fire across the streets of London. Instead, Mimoyecques became a tomb. A tomb for the forced laborers who died building the tunnels. A tomb for a weapon that would have brought only darkness. A tomb for a nightmare that never had the chance to wake. And in that tomb lies one final truth, one the world still struggles to accept. Not all miracles save. Some prevent. And sometimes, the greatest victory is the disaster that never happened.